Hello, and welcome to this learning module on physician relations with pharmaceutical and medical device suppliers, part of the PNWU Professionalism in Medicine series. The days are gone when doctors could treat patients with a few instruments and medications in a little black bag. Modern physicians interact with a vast network of pharmaceutical companies and medical device suppliers who can significantly influence their practice. To see how, on the next slide are some situations a doctor might face. Respond to each one, keep track of your responses, and then click at the bottom for the next slide. We'll get to your responses shortly, but first let's look at our objectives for this module. To understand the influence of pharmaceutical and medical device suppliers on the practice of medicine, to understand the importance of setting boundaries on relationships with suppliers, to recognize some common situations where boundary violations can occur, and to recognize ways of avoiding or correcting violations if they do occur. The key idea in all of this is that while relations with pharmaceutical and medical device manufacturers are probably unavoidable today, they need to be controlled or they can threaten patient care. The United States is the largest pharmaceutical market in the world. Pharmaceutical manufacturing and distribution is a $1 trillion a year industry in the U.S. Its impact on medical practice is both deep and wide, as shown in these statistics. Of note is that the impact extends beyond doctors in hospitals and clinics to medical education, medical students, and medical schools. This has prompted some professional organizations, such as the American Medical Student Association and the Association of American Medical Colleges, to call for limits on industry influence. Certainly when it comes to medical education. Both the AMSA Model Farm-Free Curriculum and the AAMC Task Force on Industry Funding of Medical Education urge no acceptance of any gifts by doctors or students, no participation in industry-sponsored educational programs, and no direct contact between industry representatives and students, even for things like scholarships and awards. Other professional organizations are a bit more tolerant, but all have some restrictions on industry relations. The AOA Code of Ethics, for example, allows gifts to doctors of limited value, often defined as $50 or so, provided they're related to patient care or medical practice. It also allows doctors to be compensated for industry services, such as speaking at an industry event, provided the fee is proportionate to the services rendered and not related to the use of an industry product. Here's a chance to apply that code to a question from the study guide for the U.S. medical licensing exam. Read it, pick one of the answers, A through E, from the list, and then click again for the preferred answer from the Kaplan guide, as well as an explanation. As the answer to this question suggests, working with pharmaceutical and medical device suppliers isn't all bad. With thousands of prescription drugs available and the FDA approving more every year, there have been 23 so far in 2013, it's virtually impossible for a busy doctor to know them all, let alone their specified dosages, side effects, and recommended lengths of use. Pharmaceutical representatives, then, can be important sources of information, as can industry literature, workshops, and seminars. It also makes sense for practicing doctors to be involved in testing new drugs for clinical effectiveness before they're widely distributed to the public. So, why is accepting meals or money from industry a problem? Well, the answer in a phrase is conflict of interest. Gifts and gratuities create an expectation of something in return, and that can bias a physician's judgment. A doctor might be tempted to prescribe certain drugs or treatment regimens out of self-interest rather than patient interest, as these internet news headlines claim. Interestingly, this isn't the way most doctors see it. Of all the ethical issues doctors face, taking free lunches is one of the least controversial. The 2012 Medscape Ethics Report, based on a survey of 24,000 U.S. physicians across 25 specialties, included the question, do you feel you could be unbiased with prescribing habits if you accept lunches from pharmaceutical reps? The vast majority of respondents, as you see, nearly 75%, said yes, and some, in fact, were quite defensive about it. See the comments on the right. I am outraged that a lunch or a pen or a book could be felt to be inducement for me to prescribe certain drugs. I find it insulting that it is assumed physicians will change their prescribing habits for a tuna fish sandwich. Well, righteous indignation aside, it happens. According to Bernard Lowe, there's evidence that gifts from drug companies strengthen a physician's recognition of certain products, and that doctors who attend drug company educational sessions are much more likely to prescribe the sponsor's product. Significantly, this happens even when physicians don't believe they're being influenced, leading to a perceptive comment from another respondent to that Medscape survey. If I had a couple of lunches with a rep and we developed a friendly relationship, I would feel pressure even if the rep wasn't actively exerting pressure. And here lies the real danger of conflicts of interest. They're often so subtly developed that people aren't aware that they exist. Even if a doctor could be objective, though, there's also this. Ask yourself, if your doctor prescribed a medication and you learned that he or she got benefits from the supplier, what would you think? The point is that often the appearance of impropriety is as bad as the reality. So, how should you deal with conflicts of interest? Well, frankly, doctors and professional groups disagree here. Some favor banning pretty much all contacts between doctors and industry, while others, recognizing the benefits of cooperating with industry, take a more moderate approach. An approach that strikes a balance between the two might be this one, based on 4 steps. First, recognize the most common ways in which contacts are made, so you're alerted if they occur. Drug detailing, that's specifically targeting drugs to particular doctors, knowing their prescribing patterns and the practice of medicine they're involved in. Individual gifts might range from something very simple like a pen or a notepad to something more elaborate like a notebook or a sample case or an expensive reference volume. Free samples of drugs or supplies, and continuing medical education seminars, workshops. Second, avoid certain practices that everyone seems to agree go too far. Among them might be expecting or taking direct payments to attend activities with no educational value, a cruise, for example. Taking items of personal benefit not related to medical practice, an expensive pair of cufflinks, for example. Free samples are a little bit debatable. Some physicians think there's nothing wrong with accepting those, especially if they can be distributed to patients who might not be able to afford medications otherwise. But others see it as a doorway for influence from pharmaceutical firms who eventually, of course, will expect people to pay for those drugs. Payments to enroll patients in clinical trials are generally viewed as suspect. It's one thing to ask your patients if they wish to be involved in a trial, but if, again, your patients find that you're being paid to encourage people to enroll in a trial, what will they think? The third step is to allow practices that are relatively harmless. That is, where the good outweighs the bad. For example, accepting educational materials from industry sources might be a possibility, especially if they're connected to a seminar or a workshop. Accepting modest meals that are connected to some educational activity might be reasonable. Accepting honoraria or fees for speaking at a CME workshop or session might be acceptable. And consulting fees for reviewing new products might be acceptable. Fourth, and maybe most important, be transparent about your dealings with industry. Disclose any industry ties you have to your patients and others so they can be alerted. For example, if you have a financial interest in a drug or medical device company, you own large blocks of stock in the company, or you sit on a board of directors, your patients ought to know that if you're prescribing drugs or procedures that those companies sponsor. Reveal sources of information on drug or device effectiveness. If your advice for taking a certain drug or engaging in a certain procedure comes from an industry source, your patients have a right to know that so they can make an unbiased judgment. If you accept gifts from industry, reveal those and the sources of free samples. It may not be anything more than just saying that a certain provider has given you these samples and you're making them available to your patients. Certainly, reveal industry compensation for speaking at continuing medical education events, or serving on drug review panels, or engaging in research studies. In and of themselves, those don't necessarily indicate bias, but again, people are less likely to suspect you if they know up front that you have some vested interest in the research. Whatever their position, everyone in the medical profession would likely agree with the goal here, that doctors ought to interact with industry in a way that protects individual patients, promotes public health, and preserves the public trust in medicine. Well, now it's time to see what you've learned from this module. Here are 7 questions. Write an answer to each one, and when you've completed them all, check your answers against the ones in red on the left. Well, how did you do on these? Well, I hope. If you want more information on this topic, see the links attached to this module. And if you have questions or comments, write to the email address here. Thank you for watching.